to spiritual calisthenics. Christ is in our midst. On Thursday, July 18, we commemorate the Holy Martyr Emilian, the Holy Martyrs Paul, Thea, and Valentina, St. Stephen, Archbishop of Constantinople, our Holy Father John, Archbishop of Constantinople, the Holy New Martyrs, Elizabeth the Grand Duchess, and the Novice Barbara, and St. Thea of Glasgow. Regarding St. Emilianos of Bulgaria, this martyr was from Torostolam in Thrace, the servant of a certain pagan in the days of Julian the Apostate. As a fervent Christian, Emilian abominated the error of the pagans, and one day entered the temple and broke all the idols with a hammer. Seeing that others were arrested and beaten for this, he gave himself up of his own accord. He was mercilessly whipped and cast into a fire, in which he gave up his soul, without his body suffering harm. Your martyr, O Lord, in his courageous contest for you, received as the prize the crown of incorruption and life from you, our immortal God. For since he possessed your strength, he cast down the tyrants, and wholly destroyed the demon's strength as presumption. O Christ God, by his prayers, save our souls, since thou art merciful. Regarding the holy new martyr, Elizabeth, the Grand Duchess, and also the martyr Novice Barbara, Grand Duchess Elizabeth, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England and elder sister of Empress Alexandra of Russia, was one of the most illustrious women of her day, known throughout Europe not only for her high birth and graceful beauty, but also for her modesty and goodness of heart. After marrying Grand Duke Sergius Alexandrovich, she converted to Orthodoxy, although this was not required of her by her position. After the assassination of her husband in 1905, Grand Duchess Elizabeth withdrew from public life, founding the convent of Saints Martha and Mary, of which she became the superior. There, she dedicated herself to prayer, fasting, tending the sick, and caring for the poor. After the Bolsheviks seized power, she was exiled to the Urals, where she and those with her were martyred in 1918, when they were cast alive into an abandoned mine. The Novice Barbara followed St. Elizabeth into exile. When she was separated from the Grand Duchess, Barbara asked to be allowed to join her again. To terrify her, the Bolsheviks told her that she would be allowed to do this, but only if she were prepared for unheard-of torments and a violent death. To their amazement, she consented. It was deemed worthy of martyrdom with the Grand Duchess. Their holy relics were recovered and taken through Russia to China, and came to rest in the convent of St. Mary Magdalene in Jerusalem. When their reliquaries were opened in 1981, their bodies were found to be partially incorrupt and sweet with the odor of sanctity. With them are also commemorated their fellow martyrs, Grand Duke Sergius Mikhailovich, Prince John Constantine, and Igor the Brethren, Prince Vladimir Pali, and Theodore Remes. Emulating the Lord's self-abasement on the earth, you did forsake royal mansions to serve the poor and disdained, overflowing with compassion for suffering, and taking up a martyr's cross, you in meekness did perfect the Saviour's image within you. Wherefore, with Barbara, entreat him to save us all, O wise Elizabeth. In the midst of worldliness, your mournful heart dwelt in heaven. In barbaric godlessness, your violent soul was not troubled. You did long to meet your bridegroom as a confessor, and he found you worthy of your martyric purpose. O Elizabeth, with Barbara, your brave companion, pray to the bridegroom for us all. Regarding the holy martyrs Paul, Thea, and Valentina at Caesarea in Palestine. You are an Egyptian, Paul, by tongue and race, but not by faith. Therefore you are beheaded by the sword. Make ready, Valentina and Thea, for enemies of God thrash you out of enmity for their error. This is by Eusebius of Caesarea. In the 6th year of the persecution of our days, in the year 308, up to the 6th year of the persecution which was in our days, the storms which had been raised against us were still raging, and great multitudes of confessors were in the mines, which are called Ephorites, in the country of Thebais, which is on the one side of Egypt. An account of the purple marble which is in that land, the name of Ephorites, has also been given to those who are employed in cutting it. This name, therefore, was also extended to those great multitude of confessors who were under sentence of condemnation in the whole of the land of Egypt. For there were 100 martyrs there, all but 3. And these confessors were sent, the men together and the women with children, to the governor of Palestine, whose name was Firmilianus, for he had superseded the governor Urbanus in his office, and he was a man by no means of peaceful turn. Indeed, he even surpassed his predecessor in ferocity, having been a soldier that had been engaged in war, and had much experience in blood and fighting. There is a large city in the land of Palestine teeming with population, of which all the inhabitants were Jews. It is called in the Aramaic language Lud, and in the Greek it is called Thea. To this city the governor Firmilius went, and took thither the whole assembly of those 100 confessors. And this was a great sight, which well deserves to be recorded in writing. And the Jews were spectators of this marvelous contest, having surrounded the place of judgment on all sides, as it were for a rebuke to themselves. They looked on with their own eyes at what took place, while the whole company of the confessors, with much confidence and immense courage, made their confession of belief in God's Christ. And they, being Jews, to whom the coming of that Christ had been foretold by their prophets, whose coming their fathers looked for, had not been of old the enemies of God, confessed, even amidst the persecutions, their faith in God, the Lord of all, and the manifestation from him. And these Egyptians, who had been taught by their fathers to worship idols only, were at that time, from the conviction of their reason, undergoing this conflict, in order that they might avoid the worship of idols, while those Jews, who had always been accused by their prophets on account of their worship of idols, were surrounding them, standing and looking on and listening as the Egyptians repudiated the gods of their own fathers, and confessed their faith in the same God as they also did, and bear witness for him whom they had many times denied. And they were still more cut to the heart and rent, when they heard the criers of the governor shouting and calling Egyptians by Hebrew names, and addressing them with the names of the prophet. For the criers shouted aloud and called to them and said, Elias, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, and the other appellations similar to those which their fathers had chosen from among the Hebrews, in order that they might call their sons after the names of the prophets. Moreover, it also came to pass that their deeds corresponded with their names, and the Jews greatly wondered both at them and at their names, as well as their words and their deed, being rendered despicable themselves both by their own vice and infidelity. And I myself am convinced that these things were not done without the will of God. However, after this trial they were deprived of the use of their left leg, by having the muscle of the knee cauterized with fire, and then again they had their right eyes blinded with the sword, and then destroyed by fire. And not only were they men who endured these things, but really children, and many women. After all this they were delivered over to the copper mines to see afflictions there. And after a short time the 3 men from Palestine, whom I mentioned a little while ago as having been for the moment handed over to the ludus, were called to undergo similar sufferings, because they would not take the food from the royal provision, nor would give themselves up to that exercise and instruction which were requisite for pugilism, and they suffered many evils which were not competent to describe. And at the end of all their afflictions they underwent this severe sentence. And others in the city of Gaza, being in the habit of assembling themselves for prayer, and being constant in reading of the Holy Scriptures, were seized, and had come to endure the same sufferings of their companions, being tortured on their legs and eyes. Others also had to contend in conflicts even greater than these, and after having been tortured both in their legs and eyes, were severely torn on their sides with combs. And others again, more than these, attained to this great excellence, and at the end of all contended with death itself. And when he had turned himself away from these, he came to judge one who, although a woman in body, was a hero in bravery in mind, which she possessed. She was also a virgin in her mode of life, and could not bear the threat of pollution which she heard, but at once gave utterance to harsh words against the tyrannical emperor, for having given authority to a vile and wicked judge. On this account, therefore, he in the first place bruised her body all over with stripes. Then she was hung up, and her sides were lacerated, and this not once only, but 2 and 3 times in 1 hour, and for a great while, and also repeatedly, until those who afflicted the punishment became wearied and tired. Then others succeeded them against her, and at the commands of the furious governor, tortured her most cruelly and severely. For these judges were barbarous in their manners, and enemies in their hearts. Moreover, it happened that while this furious judge was insulting this girl with his tortures, another young woman, small indeed in person, but courageous in soul, for she was possessed of a large mind, which supplied strength to the smallness of her person, being no longer able to tolerate the wickedness and cruelty of those things which were inflicted upon her sister, called out from the midst of the crowd of persons who were standing before the governor, and cried out complaining, and said, How long do you intend to tear my sister to pieces in so cruel and merciless a manner? And when the wicked Emilian heard this saying, he was bitterly incensed, and gave orders for the young woman who had complained to be brought before him. Her name was Valentina. Having therefore caught her up, they brought her into the midst of the place of judgment, but she placed her trust in the holy name of Jesus. Then the murderous governor in his fury commanded her to offer sacrifice. But the maiden Valentina despised the word even of the threatener. Then he gave orders for those who were ministering to his will to lay hold upon the girl by force and take her up to the side of the altar so that she might be polluted by the sacrifices. Then at that time of terror the noble maiden showed the courage of her mind and gave the altar a kick with her foot, and it was overturned, and the fire that had been kindled upon it was scattered about. And because she did all these things without showing any fear, the rage of the governor was roused like a wild beast, and he gave command for her to be tortured with the combs, without any mercy, so that no one man was ever torn to such a degree. And I think that, had it been possible, he would even have devoured the girl's flesh. And when at length his fury was satiated with the sight of her blood, and he had learned both by deeds and words how divine is that invincible power which arms and strengthens even little girls with courage and valor, he caused both the young women, Thea and Valentina, to be bound together, and gave sentence against them of death by fire. The name of the first was Thea, and her father's house was in the land of Gaza, and the other was from Caesarea, our own city, and she was well known to many, and her name was Valentina. And after these things, Paul the confessor was called to the conflict, and he also endured it bravely, and in the same hour was condemned to be put to death, and his sentence was to be beheaded by the sword. When then this blessed man came to the place of execution, where he was to be put to death, he besought the officer who was to behead him to have patience with him for a little while. And when the officer had granted him this desire in the first place, with a mild and cheerful voice, he offered up thanksgiving and worship and glory and supplication to God for having counted him worthy of this victory. Then he prayed for tranquility and peace for our people, and entreated God speedily to grant them deliverance. After this, he offered up prayer for our enemies, the Jews, many of whom at the time were standing around him. Then he went on in his supplication, and prayed for the Samaritans, and for those among the Gentiles who were without knowledge. He prayed that they might be converted to the knowledge of the truth. Nor was he unmindful of those who were standing around him, but prayed also for them. And oh, the perfection, which cannot be described, that he prayed even for the judge, who had condemned him to death, for all the rulers in every place, not only for them, but also for that officer, who was then going to cut off his head. And as he was offering his supplications to God, the officer heard him with their own ears praying for them, and beseeching God not to lay to their charge that which they did to him. And as he prayed for all with a suppliant voice, he turned the whole multitude that was standing by, looked on in sorrow and tears, and then of his own accord he bent down his body, put out his neck to be cut by the sword. The conflict of this victorious martyr was consummated on the 25th of the month, Tammuz. At this time, I would like to wish my sister-in-law, Valentina, a very happy name day. God bless you, and may we all have the courage of Thea, Valentina, and Paul. From St. Paul's letter to the Roman. Brethren, I am speaking to you Gentiles. Inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order to make my fellow Jews jealous, and thus save some of them. So in other words, St. Paul, who is known as the apostle to the Gentiles, is preaching to them, telling them, I want to make the Jews jealous. I want to showcase you. For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, a wild olive shoot, this meaning the Gentiles, were grafted in their place to share the riches of the olive tree, do not boast over the branches. If you do boast, remember, it is not you that support the root, but the root that supports you. You will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. It is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast only through faith. So do not become proud, but stand in awe. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. And even the others, if they do not persist in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God has the power
to graft them in again. For if you have been cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted back into their own olive tree? Meaning that we never lose hope that if someone apostates, that there is still hope that they can come back, that they too can be saved. The reading according to St. Matthew. The Lord said to his disciples, "All things have been delivered to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." So all of those who are laboring, all of us who are full of our anxieties, our worries, our stresses, if we come to Christ, he will take it from us. He will give us real rest from our anxiety. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. Now, what does that mean? A yoke is the contraption that is put over cows and horses. And there would often be, for a yoke of oxen, 2 oxen. So Christ is saying, I will take the weight. So usually you would have a more senior ox training the younger ox. And this would be the ability for the other ox to learn, but also to rest. So that ox is pulling the majority of the weight. So Christ is going to take the majority of the weight from us. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. So this gentleness and lowly in heart, meaning prios, or meek, and meek meaning that he does not get moved either by his or being bullied by being insulted. Someone that is meek is not able to be controlled. Someone that is meek is able to move where he or she wills because they're not controlled by outside forces. And you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. It's not that the weight of the world is not heavy, but because Christ is carrying 99% of it, we are able to move forward. He is able to save us.
I hope that you've enjoyed today's spiritual calisthenics. Have a blessed and wonderful day.